All right, students, as you will see, the Chapter 18 deals with the Civil War. It's long, but I'm going to go through this first section pretty quickly. It talks about the differences in the two sides. All right, slavery existed in all the states, in the border states. Those yellow ones up here, these ones right here, these are the border states. They include Delaware, Maryland, West Virginia, which broke off from Virginia during the Civil War, and Kentucky and Missouri. These states are important to the Union, though, because West Virginia and Kentucky have the Ohio River flowing alongside them, and Missouri controls this part of the Mississippi River. So those states were very important to Lincoln, and he did everything he could to keep them happy and to keep them solidified with the Union, because there was no reason that they could not have dropped away just like the rest of the southern states that were slave-owning states. All right. Delaware was important because it was close to the port city of Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. was, of course, inside the state of Maryland, so it was extremely important that that state stayed. All right, strengths and weaknesses. My chart is cut off here up on the top, but just rest assured that the North had more of almost everything. Almost everything. The only thing they lacked compared to the South was large farms. However, they do have large farming states, and Missouri was one of them. So the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Missouri, those states all grow huge crops, and they're food crops. And a lot of the northern farmers are taking advantage of the things like the mechanical reapers and things like that. So they're being very productive with their crops. The North also has more population, more money, more miles of railroads, more factories, a better political system in that its government is established, and Abraham Lincoln was a brilliant political leader. Now, the South does have some advantages, though, as you see by the bottom. They have, for whatever reason, better military leaders. Robert E. Lee was brilliant. He was a brilliant strategist and tactician. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, some of his tactics are still taught at West Point as military strategies. And they're fighting to preserve their way of life, even if they don't own slaves in the South. And remember, most people did not. It was a few wealthy people that did. Most people did not own slaves. So even if you don't own slaves in the South, your way of life depends on slavery. And so you're fighting to preserve your way of life. And they're fighting on familiar soil. So it's a lot like what the rebels had during the Revolution, as far as strengths are concerned. All right, so the goals. The goal of the South is for independence, of course. And their strategy is going to be to wait them out. Just keep the North fighting as long as they can, and hopefully they get tired of it. And they think that they're going to be able to do this. And they're also going to try to get England to come and help them. That doesn't ever work out for them, and we'll talk about why in just a little bit. They feel like they have the right to leave the country because they've joined up of their free will, just like as if you join a group at school, you can leave it. And that's how they felt that joining the country had been for the states. The states joined up because they wanted to, and now if they feel like leaving, they should be able to. Now, Lincoln in the North, Lincoln's picture is cut off over here, but his quote is not, and the quote is the important part. Lincoln and people in the North view the South's leaving as a breach of contract. They view the signing of the Constitution at the very, very beginning of the country as a contract between the states, that they're going to stay together and function as a country. And when you decide you're going to leave, that's a breach of contract. And so the rest of them have a duty and an obligation and certainly a legal right to go drag you back into being part of the country. So that is how Lincoln in the North view it. And Lincoln is about holding the country together. And if you look at the quote, I'm not going to read it to you because you can read. At first, he's not about slavery at first. He's just about holding the country together. All right, let's talk about some of the Confederate strategies. I mentioned them a little bit before. Fight a defensive war. They are not trying to invade the North for the most part. Lee does attempt this a couple times, but not for the most part. For the most part, the fighting is going to be had on the South, and that's on purpose. And keep fighting till the North gets tired, and look for help from England. Now, England has been the South's biggest trading partner, and they were trading for cotton, and we've talked about this for months. The South also sends cotton to the North, but of course they're not going to be doing that now. And they're thinking that because England needs their cotton in the textile mills, that they will come and help them with this war. However, I did some little research on my own because I was interested to see. England is a global power back in those days. It still is. It's global power. And England can get its cotton other places. Now, the South was the biggest cotton-producing region on the planet in the 1850s and 60s. Now, there's no doubt about it. I looked it up. I've looked at the numbers. But England could also get cotton by now from India and Egypt. So they didn't really have to get their cotton from the South. And in addition to that, in the 2 years right before the Civil War started, there had been bumper crops of cotton in the South, and England's cotton warehouses were stuffed to the full. So they didn't really have to come helping the South out right now. And in fact, they never come and help the South out. All right, so the Union strategies. Lincoln was, Winfield Scott was really old, but he was a really good general, and Lincoln actually had asked him, would you come and lead the troops? But, Scott is really old. He said, no, I can't do that, but I will devise a military strategy for you. And it was called the Anaconda Plan, or Scott's Great Snake. You see a picture of it at the top. And it consists of several parts, which you need to know those. Those are going to be tested. The Union is going to blockade the southern ports. This should sound familiar to you. The North would control traffic up and down the Mississippi River and eventually control that Mississippi River completely, which will cut the Confederacy in two. The object being to starve out the Confederacy. Lastly, they're going to capture the new and poorly located capital of Richmond, Virginia. Now, you might wonder why in the world did the Southerners decide to relocate their capital from Montgomery, Alabama, which is the deep South, up to Richmond, Virginia. Well, it was part of the enticement for Virginia to secede. Remember, Virginia was not with the first states that seceded. And so as Virginia was debating secession, as an enticement to help them along, the Southern government, the Confederacy, offered that. They said we would relocate our capital to Richmond. Not a good move. Now, Scott's Anaconda Plan should sound familiar because it is almost exactly the same plan that the British had during the Revolution. If you remember, the British plan was to control the ports, to control the Hudson River Valley, which would cut off the New England colonies from the rest of the colonies, and then to take control of the major cities. Okay, so Scott doesn't dream this up. It's just that his Anaconda Plan is going to be put in place on half of a continent rather than just a few colonies. All right, so it literally was Americans against Americans, and I looked up some information just to illustrate this fact. Senator John Crittenden, the one who wrote the Crittenden Plan, especially in these border states, Kentucky, Missouri especially, he had two sons. One was a general for the Union. The other one, on the far right-hand side, whose picture's almost cut off, was a general for the Confederacy. The guy who was a general for the Confederacy had served in the Mexican-American War and been held in a Mexican prison camp for 2 years, so he was probably quite the soldier. Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd, who was from Kentucky, because Lincoln was from Kentucky, her family were Confederate sympathizers. She had relatives who were serving in the Confederate Army. The average soldier is in his mid-20s, but some recruits lied about their age. If you could pass for 15 or 16 or 17, they would take you on either side, and no one is going to ask any questions. African Americans were not allowed to join even on the North at first, but it doesn't take very long before Lincoln changes his mind about that. So the soldiers were mostly farmers or people who didn't have a whole lot of money at first, maybe. And a lot of these young men saw this as a way of escaping their position and having an adventure because they don't know how bad war is. Really, because the Civil War is the first real war with a lot of photographs. By the summer of 1861, the Confederate Army had 112,000 soldiers because people were anxious to sign up at first, and the Union Army has 187,000. That's a little bit lopsided on the northern side, but not too bad. However, by the end of the war, you have about 900,000 men serving in the Confederacy and 2.1 million for the Union. So that's very lopsided. It's 2 to 1. And those numbers keep stacking up against the Southern generals during the whole war. By later in the war, the North allows and recruits African Americans, and most of the time the soldiers live in camps, and their life there isn't good because, again, there's not much known about the spreading of disease, and a lot of times these guys die even in camp from disease. They never get to see the fighting because they die in camp from getting sick in camp from diseases. And of course, there's the military hospitals and military procedures, surgical procedures, which are nothing good. They don't sterilize equipment between procedures, and they don't really know about what causes people to get infections. And so if you don't die from the amputation, you're likely to die from the infection. And so it's not a good situation. And we'll talk more about this later. It's not because the doctors are stupid, and it's not because they're trying to do a bad job. It's because they're under stress and there's so many wounded waiting for their attention.